Well, we're going to get started. I'm Dominic Tarpey. I'm one of the members of the committee that helps plan our campus services grand rounds for every year. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Shane O'Neill Hart, LCSW. Shane works in this building in the Partial Hospital Intensive Outpatient Program. So he's a therapist there. And he's going to be talking about acceptance and commitment therapy. He's had extensive training in this modality. And also, he has been at UCSF for a couple years, right? Yep. And then I'll just say that he got his MSW at Boston College, and we're just lucky to have this presentation. I'm just going to turn it right over to Shane, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Dom. I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to talk about acceptance commitment therapy, and I'm going to do this mostly for myself, but maybe for you guys. So I'll invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. Otherwise, just letting your gaze drift downward. Just taking a moment to notice what it's like to be here in this moment. To notice what you're carrying with you from the previous moment. And maybe to get in touch with why you're here. And for myself, let's see if I can carry the anxiety with me. Have it be a friend that comes along for the experience. So, I have nothing to disclose. And here are some learning objectives for today. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about myself and who I am and about some of the important influences of my background. So as Dom said, I work as a therapist in PHP, IOP, but I'm a social worker. That's a really important part of my identity. In undergraduate, I studied psychology, and I was really struck by the debate that had gone on for decades about nature versus nurture. And when I discovered social work, I found out that the field had actually found like a really workable approach to thinking about this. It's called the person and environment approach, about 100 years prior to the field of psychology. So a couple people up here. This is Jane Addams. She was the first social worker in the late 1800s. Dr. Dorothy Height, who President Obama called the godmother of the civil rights movement. Social work has always been a values-based field. I also studied biblical history, and I was struck to find out that a lot of what's written in the Bible isn't true. I know that that's shocking, but what was actually really cool, especially reading the Old Testament, was to learn that there are these stories that were passed down over generations, hundreds and thousands of years, that were used they were reinterpreted and revised over time to serve new functions, to help a community find a sense of cultural identity and meet new challenges. And so looking back, that starts to fit into this approach that I've found has been so important in my life. So I also read William James, who talked about how a person could both be psychotic and be having a genuine spiritual experience at the same time. Those things could both be true. I also studied feminist psychology and was interested in this argument that the social construction of gender is actually a far larger influence on human behavior than the biology of sex. Looking back, all of these things now make sense to me as making, kind of paving the way for my interest in contextual behavioral science. So I've been training in ACT for about 5 years, and the work I'm going to present on today is very personal, and it's been very important in my own life. If I could boil the talk down to one idea, it would be this. Joy and pain are two sides of the same coin. If you take away one thing from this talk, I hope it's this. This talk is an invitation to bring your heart fully into the work that you do, to notice if what's most painful for you in your life aligns with also what is most important to you, to notice if this is true for your clients. I also invite you to compare this approach to approaches that you use, to look for how it's different and also for how it's similar. So before I tell you about what ACT is, I want to give you a reason to care. And we're all surrounded by suffering every day, and often there's no good reason for it. Sometimes there are clear, direct explanations. Sometimes there's a well-understood disease process that led to symptoms in a very clear fashion, but this is the exception, not the rule, especially in psychiatry. ACT comes from a very different approach than the biomedical model to understanding human suffering. And I'll talk more about the underlying philosophy of science of functional contextualism. But I actually think it's a really valuable companion to the biomedical model. We know that biology and the environment are intimately intertwined, and so having a sophisticated model for understanding how the environment influences human behavior is a really valuable tool, both as researchers and as clinicians. So what is ACT? First of all, it's ACT, not ACT. So I guess if you take away two things from this talk, also remember that. It's an evidence-based therapy. It's been widely disseminated. It's used across the country in the VA. And it's a transdiagnostic and process-based approach. So what this means is that it is meant to target underlying processes that maintain and drive psychopathology across various disorders. It's also what we call a third wave behavioral therapy. So I'm going to do a quick, we're going to take a quick trip into the history of psychology just to understand what this means. So after Freud introduced psychoanalysis, there was this push for a more empirical and falsifiable approach to understanding human behavior. And so behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, who is a prolific scientist, started trying to understand the basic principles of how you can shape behavior drawing on animal models. Now, what happened when this happened was that some of the rich traditions of psychoanalysis and the other humanistic traditions to therapy, some of those, the rich nuance of behavior was lost, but there also was the development of these basic understandings of the principles of how you can shape behavior that are actually really powerful and still used today in many treatment settings. There was also really no, in the first wave of behavioral therapy, really no way to account for the complexity of human cognition. So that brought about the second wave, which you'll probably recognize. This is Aaron Beck, who's the founder of cognitive therapy, what we think of as CBT. His daughter, Judith Beck, who's also been very well known. So the second wave sought to account for the role of cognition in human behavior. This is a different philosophy of science than Skinner was coming from. This is what we think of as a mechanistic philosophy of science. There's an assumption of underlying structures. And so in CBT, the idea is that there are these cognitive distortions. I mean, this is an oversimplification, but the idea that there are these cognitive distortions, and if we can alter those, then we can have a resulting change. It's a different kind of philosophy of science than what we'll talk about in a bit. Also, David Burns, who you might be familiar with, wrote this book called The Feeling Good Handbook, which was massively popular, and it brought CBT to the masses. I want to stop here, and this is not a polemic against CBT, because modern CBT has become something very different than what this was, but I do want to think about what are the implications of the promise of the Feeling Good Handbook. Would a reasonable person conclude that this therapy should lead to the absence of feeling bad? Or at least a significant reduction in it? And what if it doesn't? ACT addresses this issue by not promoting the elimination of unwanted thoughts and feelings, but the promise of a more meaningful and rich life. Also, it seems like David Burns has come along. In the past few years, he developed a new model. It's called TEAM, and includes acceptance and mindfulness. The third wave of behavioral therapy is all of these things that you see up top fit within this third wave. Though the people who created these might not agree, they all came from different backgrounds and arrived here in different ways. But the kind of overarching themes are the integration of acceptance and mindfulness based approaches, as well as this idea of functional contextualism, which we'll dive into just a little bit. And by the way, this is Marsha Linehan, who created DBT, Steve Hayes, who co-created ACT, John Kabat-Zinn, who created MBSR, and then the integration of Buddhist ideas of Buddhist philosophy is also a common theme. So the philosophical roots of ACT include this idea of functional contextualism, which I'll explain. It's based in radical behaviorism, which is something that Skinner created. I'm not going to try to explain what radical behaviorism is, other to say then it's an approach where behavior is understood as everything that we do, including thinking, feeling, and any other form of what we call private events. So it's a broader definition of behaviorism than was used prior to Skinner. And then relational frame theory, which is we'll talk a little bit about. So functional contextualism interestingly has common philosophical roots with constructivism, narrative psychology, dramaturgy, and feminist psychology. So that's why I made that comment about looking back at my history, like the things that I was interested in actually all came from a similar philosophy as functional contextualism. So the idea here is that behavior can only be understood in the context. A particular client with a particular learning history in a particular situation, the only way that we can understand what function of behavior serves is seeing it in that larger context. So an example of this is if after a long day of work, I watch Netflix, this might function as a form of self-care. If I've avoided going to work for a week and I'm watching Netflix, it might function as a way of avoiding the anxiety as my emails pile up. Another core concept here is what we call the pragmatic truth criterion. So we're not interested in the absolute truth of an idea. We can think about this with the mechanistic philosophy of science, where you're actually trying to get at what is the mechanism by which this disease or this problem is acting. We're actually interested in the idea of workability. So we're looking for a way to interface with the problem, even if we're not describing what's actually happening. So this comes into play in ACT when we look at thoughts. We're not going to try to prove thoughts right or wrong. We're going to look at whether that thought is being useful in that moment, and is it leading me in the direction of my values. And just to say that philosophy of science is really important to understand because it frames the assumptions that researchers and clinicians use in approaching the work that they do, and a lot of the debates that have happened over history have happened from a place of no acknowledgement that you're actually coming from two different angles or approaches to understanding what we're talking about. So relational frame theory, I'm not going to go very deep into this because it's a huge world, it's very complex, it's very interesting. But when ACT was first created, it was called comprehensive distancing therapy. This was in the late 80s. And they did a few randomized controlled trials, and then Steve Hayes and the other people who created it, they decided to stop, and they took a 15-year hiatus and they developed relational frame theory, which is a theory of verbal behavior or of human language. And so RFT considers language to be a learned behavior which is established through operant learning. So you can think about how a child learns to name different fruits. So a child might be presented with a banana and the parent says, "This is a banana." And then in the future, when the child accurately identifies that fruit, saying banana, the child says, "Good job." So that's a behavior that's positively reinforced. It's what we call a directly trained relation. But the child can also do what we call derive a relation. The child can now say banana, and then the parent may produce a banana, and that behavior is reinforced. And that's a derived relation. The difference is that the child was never learned to make the association in that direction. So this idea of bidirectional relations, this is something that's unique to humans. Primates and other animals can learn forms of language, but they cannot derive relations. And this gets really complex. Over time, we start building these vast networks of relations, which basically constitute thinking. We may start to relate abstract concepts like anxiety and bad, or therapy and weak. We can see how these kinds of associations could be problematic. So RFT helps us understand a number of behaviors, including what we call reason giving. Reason giving is the behavior which we're all socially conditioned to, is to have so-called good reasons for the things that we do. So think about a child who doesn't go to school one day, and the parent asks what happened. If the child says, "Well, I was sick," or "I felt scared," the child's a lot less likely to be punished than if they said, "Well, I just wanted to play video games." And so there's a way in which reason giving is reinforced. What can happen though is we start to believe that the reasons are actual causes for our behavior. So if the reason that I've been staying in my house is because I'm anxious, well then if I'm going to overcome my agoraphobia, do I need to get rid of my anxiety? So RFT helps us understand the traps that language get us into and the traps of control. So I'm going to talk more about the therapy. I just want to talk about the evidence real quick. The Division 12, the Society of Clinical Psychology at the APA, has endorsed ACT for the treatment of chronic pain, depression, mixed anxiety, OCD, and psychosis. And then SAMHSA has also endorsed it for kind of a more broad treatment for substance abuse. There's been over 300 RCTs. Most of these have been in the past 15 years. I mentioned that there was this big 15-year gap. for all of these problems that are listed here. And then there's been 49 meta-analyses, and I think there'll be a 50th this year. So the evidence for ACT is really strong, it's growing. We're gonna talk about the therapeutic stance. So this is fundamental to the therapeutic stance in ACT. Clients are not broken and do not need to be fixed. So we don't want to do anything that reinforces clients' fusion, and we'll talk about what fusion means, but fusion with the idea, any idea that limits their flexibility to make meaningful change in their lives. We're all in the same boat, so embodying common humanity, not setting ourselves up as the therapist, as being the expert with the solution to our clients' problems, but we're working on this together, and also we're struggling with similar kinds of problems because we're both human. Radical change is possible quickly, and it's framed as a choice. Internal experiences are not the problem. It's our efforts to control them, and not just efforts to control, but efforts that are excessive and misapplied. Experiential learning is the best way to learn, so it's show, don't tell. So we use metaphor and experiential exercises, and we invite clients to recognize if their experience is consistent with what we're saying. We're never trying to argue or convince that what we're saying is right. And then we use self-disclosure and model flexibility. So self-disclosure might look something like, in a difficult moment, saying something like, gosh, I'm feeling pretty discouraged right now. I'm gonna try to make room for that so we can keep working on what's important to you. Or, I'm noticing that I'm getting pretty mindy up in my head. Let me take a deep breath and come back to the here and now. These are things that therapists might do in the moment to kind of model, this is how these processes are actually at play for me as well. So experiential avoidance is in core to the understanding of psychopathology within ACT, or suffering in general. So experiential avoidance is basically any attempt to eliminate unwanted internal experiences. These are our thoughts, feelings, sensations, memories, urges, especially when this is, or even when this is harmful or ineffective. So almost any behavior can serve as avoidance. This is why it's important to be able to do a functional analysis and understand what is the behavior, what is the function of the behavior in this particular context. So looking at these behaviors here, like isolation, for example, that could be avoidance, but in a certain context, it also could be a form of self-care. Thought suppression and rumination are interesting ones to look at because they're actually they look very different, trying to suppress a thought versus intentionally engaging with a pattern of thought. But they look very different, but they could actually serve the same function, which is trying to control anxiety. So this is what we call the difference between a topographic approach versus an ideographic approach to understanding behavior. Topographic being, what does the behavior look like? Ideographic being, what is the function of the behavior? If I have a thought like, I should kill my family, which some of our clients do, and I'm upset by it, it actually makes perfect sense that I would want to make it go away. And so Steve Hayes, who one of the co-creators, says, we like to use strategies that are perfectly sensible, logical, rational, and pathological. So there's actually, we try to understand human behavior from a sense that we're actually doing something that makes sense, it's just misapplied control. So the ACT theory of psychopathology includes this, that psychological well-being is not assumed as normative. We assume that normal processes or logical processes can lead to suffering. Rule-governed behavior, which is a form of fusion, which we'll talk about, doing the right thing can limit flexibility. Experiential avoidance is supported by entanglement with language. Loss of contact with reinforcers, so loss of contact with the things that make life meaningful and enjoyable, can help explain depression and anhedonia. And then engaging in unworkable control strategies understandably leads to hopelessness. This is core to understanding the ACT approach. So the goal of treatment in ACT is increased psychological flexibility, which here is defined by Steve Hayes in his most recent book as the ability to feel and think with openness, to attend voluntarily to the present moment, and to move your life in directions that are important to you, building habits that allow you to live life in accordance with your values and aspirations. So we're going to walk through the ACT model of psychological flexibility in a second. Just want to show this. This is what's called the Acceptance and Action Questionnaire. This is how psychological flexibility is operationalized. And you can notice looking at these questions, it's a different approach than we would use in measures like the PHQ-9 or other symptom inventories. We're more interested in what is the relationship to these experiences. And This is cool to use, and I personally am advocating for us to use this more as a companion to other measures, because this has some, I'm not going to go deeply into it, but there's some nice predictive evidence of psychological flexibility, how it predicts how people cope with the trauma, their ability to quit smoking. It's transdiagnostic. It's less focused on the presence of unwanted thoughts and feelings in a given moment, and it has this, seems to have this longer predictive value. So this is the ACT model of psychological flexibility. It's called the Hexaflex. It can be a little bit confusing. We're gonna walk through it. So there are 6 core processes in ACT. So acceptance or willingness, so up here. Sometimes called willingness because there are actually some connotations that clients often have with acceptance. It can kind of be like getting beaten over the head with it. So willingness is framing it as a choice. Making the choice to openly experience what shows up without needless defense and with a recognition of the costs of control. Diffusion, this is stepping back from our thoughts, not getting caught in unhelpful entanglements with language. Contact with the present moment. This is simply being in the here and now. This is what I oriented you at the beginning of the talk. Not the there and then, attending to what is available to us in the moment. Self as context. This is getting in touch with the part of us that is unchanging amidst all of our changing experiences and environments, often referred to as the observer self. And this process is also involved in what we call flexible perspective taking. And we'll talk more about that. And then values, here. Clarifying what we want most in life, what makes life meaningful, and making intentional decisions to move in this direction. And then committed action, which is taking concrete and values-based actions in the moment and investing in larger patterns of action over time. So this can be simplified, since that's a little bit complicated, broken down as open, so diffusion and acceptance, being open to our thoughts and feelings, aware, contact with the present moment, aware of ourselves in the moment, and aware of ourselves as the observers of our experience, and then active, taking action consistent with our values. So before we go through all of those in more detail, I want to talk about one other process. It's called creative hopelessness. This sits outside of the Hexaflex, but it integrates multiple of the other processes. So the goal here is to confront the system of control. So this is all the things that we do to try to avoid our internal experiences. And the goal is to help the client make contact with the hopelessness of continuing to engage in an unworkable control agenda. So the hopelessness is not in the client. The hopelessness is in doing something that can't work. So what we do is we go through actually a list of behaviors, all the things a client is doing, and we try to identify what's the function of these behaviors. Is it avoidance? And then clarify the choice between continuing to use ineffective avoidance versus being willing to try something new. This process can actually be very validating, because what you're doing is you're saying to the client, you've actually been working very hard. You've been trying to do something. Look at, and you might say something like, no one can call you lazy. You've been trying so hard to get rid of your anxiety. Look at all that you've sacrificed. And that usually hits the client, and they feel it pretty strongly, but it's actually out of this place of hopelessness where they might actually experience a sense of despair. And the goal is not to make the client feel bad, but actually to bring them in contact with what's already happening and with the costs of the behaviors that they're engaging in, and then to present willingness as an alternative. So just a quick case example. So this is a young woman with a history of self-harm, restricted eating, and other harmful behaviors that seem to function as avoidance in response to overwhelming relationship distress. So this process would be going through these behaviors and identifying when the function is avoidance, actually listing everything that they're doing. And this might include saying, even coming here to therapy, the function of that behavior might be that you're hoping I'm going to give you the solution to not feeling this distress. And you get to this place where the client's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Out of this place, so then next, we look at the costs, and the costs include, you're spending all this effort trying to control your experiences, trying to control your thoughts and feelings, and you're missing out on your life. Like, what are the things that matter to you that you're not investing in because of all the effort that you're putting into these behaviors? You validate, like we talked about, And then you introduce a different approach. Like what if the whole system, maybe the reason that this hasn't been working, the reason that you're so upset and hopeless is because the system is rigged. That like, the approach that you're taking is one that can't work, and what if there's another approach that can work? One that can lead to a meaningful, values-filled life, but it just means that we're not gonna be able to have a life without pain. So this is where this skill is where the difference between understanding this stuff in your mind, which I hope everyone in this room is getting it on some level intellectually, the difference between doing that and being able to do it skillfully in the room becomes really important. In order for this to be effective, the therapist must be willing to sit with the discomfort that comes up in this process, resist the urge to jump in and save the client from their own distress, and by offering false hope. And despite the label of hopelessness, clients often find this deeply validating and actually inspiring once you get to a place where it's like, well, I've been trying, and one of the metaphors that comes up is it's like being stuck in a hole and the only tool you have is a shovel, so you keep digging. You keep engaging in behaviors that feel familiar because you want to be doing something, yet it's actually digging you deeper and deeper. And so then when you present, well, maybe there's this other way, and that's kind of often how you frame treatment. Well, we could work on something else. So we're going to walk through the 6 processes, and we're going to start with acceptance, also called willingness. So these are all skills. Most of these you could think of as skills, but they're also processes that happen in the moment, interpersonally between you and the client. And so you'll notice, as if you train and act, you'll learn to pick up on these in the moment and work with them in the moment, which is the best place to work with them, as opposed to saying, oh, it seems like you have a problem with acceptance, we're going to spend a session focused on acceptance. It's actually what we notice, and this is where the functional analysis comes into play. So what we have here is tips on when to work with the process. So signs of experiential avoidance that you'll notice in session include changing the topic, making jokes in response to uncomfortable content, affect that's incongruent with the content that the client is presenting, or body language that's closed off. And so ways to kind of work with this are asking questions like, are you willing to stay with this feeling instead of running away from it, staying with it? And that's a little bit of emotional exposure built into what you're doing. What's hardest about that? Or what's in there that you can't have? And so we also work with metaphor. So these are a couple of the metaphors that we use in ACT. So you might be familiar with the Chinese finger cuffs. The idea here is the more that you resist, the tighter and tighter it gets. This is a nice experiential way of showing how suffering can be exacerbated by our unwillingness to have pain. So that's one that I often do in a group setting, and you can do it individually, you can do it with groups. Being stuck in quicksand. I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but if you get stuck in quicksand, the right thing to do is not to struggle, it's not to try to get out, but it's actually to lay flat. So this is another metaphor for willingness. And then tug of war with the monster. And this is another one that's done nicely experientially in groups. So you identify what are the experiences that the client is trying to run away from. Is it self-criticism around being a failure, around how things are never going to work out? And you set this up as, it's like you're caught in this tug of war between you and the monster, like the failure monster. And between you is this pit. And the monster's trying to pull you in, and every time the monster pulls, you pull even harder. This is the entanglement with language. This is the unwillingness or the experiential avoidance that we engage in. And we keep trying and trying, but we can't ever seem to pull this monster in. And so where you eventually get is, well, what happens if you drop the rope? Dropping the rope gives you the opportunity to go live your life. Your hands are free. You can focus on your values. But the catch-22 is that the monster doesn't go away. Those voices, those feelings are going to continue to show up. Can we make space for them and focus on what's important to us? So the next process is diffusion. I want to talk about what is fusion. Is this going to work? Okay. So you can think about fusion like this. This is when you get fused with your thoughts. This is when we get really stuck in language, when we take our thoughts literally, and when we don't notice that we're engaging in an ongoing process of thinking, but we take our thoughts at face value. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for a second. Again, I just want you to bring an image to mind. of aluminum foil. If you take a piece of it and you crumple it up and then put it in your mouth and start chewing, just notice what shows up. You can open your eyes. If you noticed any discomfort or distress, that's fusion. That's taking language seriously. Language is very powerful, and then we use tools like this. So this is a very short version. There's another exercise called the lemon exercise, where you go through this much more extensively. The goal is to show, okay, language is very powerful. It creates these intense physiological sensations that we can notice. And so if I can do that with tinfoil, I can do it with lemon, then what does a word like worthless or failure, what kind of feelings, emotions, sensations are associated with that based on our learning history? We probably don't go into explaining that part of it to the client. That's why we're trying to do this experientially. And it turns out that there's no worthlessness or failure inside of you. It's something that happens as an interaction between us and the word. And so taking language and putting it out in front of us and noticing, our thoughts are not reality. They're not some objective metric of what's going on in the world. They're a bunch of words that our mind is producing. Sometimes they're useful, sometimes they're not so useful. So diffusion helps us loosen up our language, our relationship with language. And so when to work with this process is when we spot fusion. So some signs of this are black and white thinking, vast generalizations, excessive judgments, comparisons, literal or rigid use of language, a strong focus on the past or future, when the client is trying to figure out or understand why, especially when this is a barrier to moving forward. Well, I need to understand why before I take any action. When they're overly analytical. And another sign is when you feel, as a therapist, like you want to argue with the client. This is usually a sign that the client is very fused with their thinking. When you want to convince them, it's usually helpful to step back and see if we can actually put our thoughts out and notice them as thoughts instead of getting so caught in them. So how do we open the door? How do we work with this process? Things like, can we take a look at that thought? Are you willing to see it as a thought and not take it at face value? Asking questions like, how old is that thought? How far back does it go in your history? Or pointing out, oh, there's the I'm a failure story again. What this does is it orients the client to the historical nature of thinking. This maybe thought doesn't have this much to do with what's going on in this moment. It's something that's been showing up at a lot of different moments in your life. And so maybe it's not that useful. Maybe it's not giving us valuable information in this moment. We might ask, let's assume that that thought is true. What then? How does this change the situation? Or where does that thought lead you? What is this thought in the service of? So diffusion is something we do in the moment, but it's also something we set up, we describe with psychoeducation, we talk about, and I don't think I have enough time to go through all of these, but we talk about how our minds love problem solving. And problem solving is something that we do, and it's very effective in many areas of life. If you're an engineer and you build buildings, your problem solving mind is a really valuable tool. If you're trying to problem solve why your life is so horrible and why you're a terrible person, it's not a very effective use of language. Networks are only additive. So, and we don't necessarily go into detail describing this to clients, but there's often this idea that we can change or replace thoughts. But what we know about from RFT, what we know about how verbal networks are developed is that we don't get to go in and delete verbal networks or verbal relations. We can only add new thoughts and new associations. So we can think about this, and I'll talk this a little bit more when we compare ACT to other models like CBT, but there's a way to understand how can we be flexible in our use of language. Are we promoting flexibility by adding more as opposed to trying to subtract? The difference between primary and secondary properties of language. So a good example of this is this phrase, a dime is larger than a nickel. There's a symbolic aspect that a dime carries more value than a nickel, but an inherent property of language, or a primary property, is something like size, which is measurable and very concrete. And so our minds often confuse these things, so we treat something like this podium is made of wood as the same kind of evaluation as I'm a failure. Even though one, again, is concrete and scientific, we can prove scientifically this is made of wood, whereas failure is something that has to do with my learning history and evaluation I'm making about myself. And then we just think about thoughts as a choice. Thoughts are a choice in the moment. It might be giving you valuable information, and it might be giving you, an option to go and do something. And so an example here is, I've had a little bit of anxiety preparing this talk, and I went to a concert with my wife on Friday, and I had the thought, maybe I should be working on the presentation. It wasn't a very useful thought in the moment, unless I was gonna leave and go home, and that would have been abandoning my wife, which would have not been a very values-based move in the moment. So the best values-based option that I had at that time was to basically notice, these are thoughts, they're not that helpful, let me focus on being present right now. Now, if I were at home watching TV and I had the thought, maybe I should work on my presentation, that might be a pretty useful thought, and I can actually act on it. So some of the techniques we use is, think of your mind as like a radio station that you can't turn off. So just orienting clients to the fact that your mind likes to think this is what it does. It's not going to stop thinking, but we can focus on something else. Forms of what we call Titchener's repetition, which is a way that you repeat a word, maybe a word like failure, over and over and over until it starts to lose its meaning, and it exposes this is just a jumbled mix of sounds as opposed to something that carries so much weight. Simply saying I'm having the thought that puts even just a little bit of distance between a thought. And then leaves on a stream is a meditation which you guys are probably familiar with. Noticing your thinking, each time you have a thought, placing it on a leaf, letting it float on by. Contact with the present moment. So this is a process that we use when clients seem to be caught in their thoughts or unable to describe their experience. So orienting to what their experience is in the moment, asking questions about what do you notice in your body. When they're stuck in the future or past, when there's avoidance that shows up, so this could be similar to willingness when they change the topic. Did you notice what just happened there? When they're not attending to cues from the therapist. It's also something we might use in response to dissociation, focusing on grounding. This is common to all forms of mindfulness practice, by the way. So questions like what's showing up for you right now, pointing out, and another form of any form of reinforcement we do that happens in the moment. So you might simply say when a client is describing an aspect of their experience, good noticing is a way of using verbal reinforcement. Self as context. So this is notoriously one of the most difficult for people to understand, and it can get very intellectual. And so our goal is not to try to help our clients get this intellectually, it's try to help them understand this experience experientially. So one of the nice, useful metaphors that you're probably familiar with if you have any experience with mindfulness is you are the sky, your thoughts and feelings and everything else is the weather. There's this part of you that's unchanging, that's always there, unchanged by your experience. Sometimes your emotions are high, sometimes they're low, sometimes they're strong, sometimes they're weak, yet there's this part of you that stretches across all of your experiences. This is also called the observer self, and this idea is that self as context, we're the context for our experiences as opposed to the content of our experiences. We're not our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, we're not our identities, which is something that people often get very fused with, their self-concept. And then self as context also involves forms of flexible perspective taking. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So when to use this process? When there's a strong identification with internal experiences, when there's an attachment to a rigid self-concept. So if a person has a very strong self-concept as a victim, this might prevent them from taking responsibility for their actions. And so we might work with, well, this is one of the identities or one of the labels that you use to describe yourself, but look at all of these different aspects of yourself, and that there's a you across all these experiences, the part of you that notices. When they struggle with inability to take other people's perspectives. It's also not something we would necessarily do in the moment in response to dissociation, but kind of by definition, somebody who's dissociating is struggling with a form of perspective taking. So it's a skill that we might build up to help somebody who struggles with dissociation. So questions like, who is the one of noticing that? Orienting our clients just to the shifting nature of experiences. Notice how sometimes your emotions are really strong, sometimes they come on and they last a long time, sometimes they're very short. Anything we're doing where we're working with the compassionate observer is a form of self as context. And then any kind of perspective taking through, so these are relational frame theory helps us understand these frames. the here, now frame, there versus then, me versus you, so intrapersonal, interpersonal, other processes that are temporal and spatial. These are frames that we all use in our language, but understanding them in a little bit more detail helps us understand how we can use them effectively clinically. So values, think about it as freely chosen qualities of being, how you want to be in the world, what makes life meaningful. We like to measure values through action, not through feeling, because again, if a value is to feel good, then that gets us back into the trap. Well, if I'm not feeling good, then it's not worth doing. And so we use perspective taking to help people get in touch with their future selves, looking back. What would make your life meaningful? And we'll talk about that with the 80th birthday exercise. Like, fast forward to the end of your life and look back. Looking back, what was important about your life? That form of, often what's meaningful to us is not in the moment necessarily enjoyable, but it's something that we look back and say that was really worth doing, that was really important to me. Because often things that are important to us involve a mix of complicated feelings. Values are a direction, not a destination, or a process, not an outcome. And they're distinct from morals or cultural norms. And values work helps clients get in touch with intrinsic reinforcers. So hopefully they become self-sustaining over time and developing patterns of behavior. So when we work with values, when clients are unaware of the cost of avoidance, when they report a lack of meaning or purpose, when there's resistance or willfulness, or simply just an unclear sense of values, you might ask a question like, if you weren't struggling with this problem, if you didn't have anxiety, then what would you do, or what would you want your life to be about? This is sometimes called the miracle question. And then the client will say, well, I would go and I would start trying to find relationships, or I would start, trying to find a new job. And then we would actually work on how can we work on those behaviors and forget the part about getting rid of the anxiety. How can we help you be with the anxiety while promoting or going after what's important to you? Some of the interventions that we use, so I think I mentioned the 80th birthday exercise. The sweet spot exercise is an exercise that you have the client experientially bring up a memory of a sweet moment in their life, really experience it. You might take a couple minutes to get into what was going on, who were you with, what was the experience like, and then tap into what was the value here? Was it spending time in nature? Was it spending time with friends? Was it being creative or autonomous? The heroes exercise, looking at somebody who you look up to as a way of tapping into values. And then this is right here is what's called a values card sort, which is an exercise where you can basically have clients rate, these values are really important to me, these ones are not so important to me, and then use that as a focus of setting, so the next step is to move into committed action, where you set concrete goals, hoping to help clients invest in patterns of behavior that are self-sustaining over time. Inevitably, doing this work is you're going to encounter barriers, cognitive and emotional barriers, that then you're going to have to loop back around and work with other processes. So an ACT therapy is not a protocolized therapy where you're going to start, or it's not supposed to be, we're going to start session 1, we're going to do acceptance, session 2, we're going to do diffusion. It's something where you're going to be moving fluidly throughout these processes, all 6 of them probably within any given session. And just a rule of thumb is like, don't set goals that a dead person could accomplish. So we want to set affirmative goals, not goals like, well, I'm going to stop being so critical to myself. I'm going to start doing something as opposed to stop doing something. When do we work with committed action? Following values clarification, when values are talked about abstractly, when there's avoidance of commitments, need for concrete goal setting, or lack of follow through. Questions like, what can you do today to move in that direction? How can you apply your values in this situation? And focusing on the when, where, how, who, and what, like really boiling it down to what are you going to do, when are you going to do it? This part of it, really easy to overlook, coming back to it, problem solving. This is, common to many approaches, but especially a behaviorally focused approach is really going to focus on if you're not doing the behaviors, the treatment is not working. So this work has been really powerful in my own life. Writing this presentation was pretty anxiety provoking because it's something that I care about, so that makes a lot of sense. Also struggle with perfectionism, so I worry about getting things wrong. So some of these skills, like allowing, willingness to feel the anxiety, has helped me like create the space to do the work, to practice self-compassion, to make the space for self-compassion. Diffusion, helping me avoid getting like entangled in my thoughts, worries about like, you're gonna get this detail wrong or that wrong, and just get it done. So, you know, and there's differences between ACT, and I think it's very compatible with other approaches, but it also has a pretty radical perspective on our openness and willingness to feel and to share in the experience of feeling and not be scared of our internal experiences. And something I found has been like profoundly useful in my work with clients is deepen my relationship with them when I've really gotten into the work. And it can be very intellectual, but it's really deeply emotionally powerful work. I want to make sure there's enough time, so I think I'll just quickly mention, like, here's a case conceptualization we can think about. A 60s woman with depression who reports anhedonia, seems to be attached to an identity of being disabled, ruminates about why she's so stuck, and insists on finding answers before she can move forward. So we can think about that in terms of the ACT processes we've talked about. Fusion with thoughts, the need to understand. I need to resolve this problem in my mind before I can actually take meaningful action in my life. And who's had clients who say things like this? Well, I'm gonna start exercising once I feel better, or once I get over my social anxiety, then I'm gonna go and I'm gonna start meeting people, right? Rigid attachment to a self-concept. And then avoidance leads to a lack of meaningful behaviors, which reinforces anhedonia. And then when people start engaging in behaviors, they often report that they don't find them pleasurable. And then we can look at, like, are they actually present while they're engaging in those behaviors? And how long is it gonna take? It could take a really long time of re-engaging in behaviors before they start to get in touch with the intrinsic reinforcers. Because if you have a control agenda where I don't wanna feel anything bad, and then you start doing things that cause anxiety, the natural response may be, I'm gonna shut down, I'm not gonna feel anything. So it's really, really hard to overcome those kind of behaviors. But instead of seeing, you know, it's a very different kind of approach to anhedonia, I think, than we sometimes come at it. So some of the variations of ACT include emotion efficacy therapy, which I wanna promote because we had April West, who's the co-creator of that, come and do a training for us last week in our program. And this is an ACT DBT hybrid model, so it's really cool, really consistent. Those two approaches go really well together. There's something called the ACT matrix, something called compassion-focused ACT, which is bringing together compassion-focused therapy and ACT. These two things seem to blend really well, and you can think about, secure attachment, and think about a child who has a secure attachment. What do? They explore the world openly and courageously. So there's this way in which compassion, the caregiving that a parent gives to a child, promotes flexibility. And so flexibility and compassion seem to be like concepts that are intertwined. Integrating ACT with other approaches. Behavioral activation fits very neatly with inside of ACT. You can see how it fits into the values and committed action work. Exposure and response prevention. You can think about ACT as a way of front-loading, building flexibility so that people can do exposure work more flexibly. And then, as I said, compassion-focused approaches fit really neatly. Just a quick comment about comparing ACT to some other approaches. In particular, CBT. This would probably be historically the biggest kind of rift between ACT and what we talked about, the second wave, traditional CBT. There's this concept of cognitive disputation, the idea that you're going to change or alter thoughts. The thing is that modern CBT, the way that it's taught now, is this idea of cognitive reappraisal, which is actually, I think, pretty consistent with ACT. It's usually expanding networks, not trying to shrink them. So adding thoughts, looking for alternative explanations. It's not trying to say, oh, let me replace that thought with another one. I don't know if anyone ever actually did that. That might be a caricature, but people certainly talk about it that way, and there have been these big fights between these camps. So I think it can be helpful. We can do CBT from an ACT perspective. We're just thinking, am I promoting flexibility with this intervention? Is this intervention helping the client have a more flexible relationship to their thoughts? Or is it actually reinforcing rigidity? Acceptance versus distress tolerance. You'll notice I didn't talk at all about distress tolerance. This might seem like a problem, because you could think, well, a lot of distress tolerance skills in DBT are forms of avoidance. But it's actually not really a problem when you think about the fact that, well, avoidance could be a values-based behavior in a given moment. Sometimes I need to shut down what I'm feeling. I might be in a job interview and feel like I'm gonna cry, so I distance a little bit from my feelings. That's functional, it's workable, there's nothing wrong with that. And in this EET, emotion efficacy therapy protocol, I really loved how she talked about the idea of mindful coping instead of distress tolerance is something you do when you have lost contact with your values. So if you're not able to access your values in the moment, that's when you might use a distraction or avoidance-based skill. But the goal is really to get back to, can I act on my values? And if I can do that, then I'm going to bring my thoughts and feelings with me. And then just thinking more generally about ways to use language that are helpful versus harmful. Like I said before, well, using language to decide exactly what kind of broken you are or why you're a terrible person is not a helpful use of language, but using language to discover gratitude or to imagine a future in which you could retire early, which motivates you to save money, that's like a really helpful use of language. So ACT really helps us understand how can we use language as a tool. So if you want to learn more about ACT, the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, this is kind of the overarching organization that includes ACT, RFT, something called functional analytic psychotherapy, cognitive focused therapy. Those people have been spending a lot of time in this world as well. So we learn best experientially, so I recommend boot camps, the 4-day trainings or the 2-day trainings, peer consultation groups if you're interested in that. It's something I'm involved with, so I'm happy to talk about that personally. ACT consultation or supervision, all of these are experiential ways of learning, doing role plays, doing the therapy, not talking about doing the therapy like I am today. This is the worst way to learn how to do ACT, by the way. So thank you for coming to my talk. And then there's a regional chapter of ACBS, so if you're interested in that, sign up. There's a regional conference we're going to be having in May. There's a lot of books that I could recommend, but I'm just going to recommend one book. This is Robin Walser. This is who I do supervision with, who is a lovely, amazing, incredibly talented therapist. And her book, I think, comes out in a few days, but I think it's already out for some reason. It's called The Heart of ACT, because she has been doing this for, I think, 25 years and is considered to be the person who really holds the heart-centered nature of this work, while also being somebody who's incredibly skilled at the functional analysis and the intellectual side of the work. She's somebody who, when you see her do it, it looks nothing like the terminology and the technical terms that I use today. It's very human and relatable. These are my references. I want to promote the next intensive services grand rounds with Dr. Jiaying Zhou, right here, who's going to talk about compassion-focused therapy for hoarding. And I'm going to leave you with this, because I said it's the one thing I want you to take away, and think about if this is true in your life as well. And thank you. So I think I have a few minutes for questions. Realize how quickly I went, so hopefully you took that all in. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about ACT's application for folks with psychotic disorders, like maybe changing the relationship to persecutory auditory hallucinations or grandeur? I
think, yeah. It's probably one area that I have less experience with. I mean, although I've used ACT with a lot of people with psychosis, but I actually think that CBT-P and ACT, I think CBT for psychosis is the most ACT-y of most of the CBTs. There's ways that seem to be more flexible relationships to language. I think identifying what is the story, how long has the story been around, maybe it goes back all the way to your childhood. Does it have something to do with the fact that it was protective, especially if you grew up in a home where there were dangers and threats. And I think it can be a relief to get out of the trap of trying to convince a client that not that we should ever be trying to convince a delusional client that their delusions are wrong, but even the things that stem from that, should they make this choice to go to this place? Thinking of a client who had this neurological issue that she really needed to see a neurologist, and she had this delusional reason for not going to see the neurologist. She kept canceling appointments, and so frustrating. I really wanted her to go to see the neurologist because it was a really important issue. And anyway, those are moments where you get frustrated, where you can be like, okay, this client is very fused. Yeah.
Do you have any words that can help explore fusion and diffusion without the word itself? Because it seems like it's also like a hard word to grasp until conceptualizing it.
Yeah, I didn't mention this, but we should probably almost never say fusion with clients, right? Sticky is a really sticky thought is one way, you know, that seems like it's really got a hold on you. It has really grasped you. Attach. I had a client, I didn't mention this, but it's always best to work with metaphors that come out of the content that the client is saying. I mean, there's these canned metaphors and they're fine, but really if you can get something that resonates with the client and then developing a metaphor out of that. So I had this client whose husband hanged himself 4 years prior, and then she had this, and all the things she was talking about were about being tied to him. And so there was this metaphor of the rope, and it was really gruesome, but it was also really powerful and meaningful to her. And so I think there was this way, if I can remember correctly, there was this way which we talked about, like having it hold on you. And I think also the story had a hold on her as well. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts? Yeah.
How does, dialectics going even beyond DBT, but just the dialectic foothold and kind of polar opposites or opposites, is that a way to help that kind of thesis antithesis?
I think so. I think dialectics promote flexibility, right? I think the people who created ACT had reasons that they wanted to make it a distinct philosophy apart from dialectics, and but I think dialectics are super helpful, and I think there are some people who seem to be really zealots about ACT, and like we're never going to work with content and we're never going to offer thoughts. And I liked this emotion efficacy therapy training because she talks about coping thoughts, and it's all about what the function of the thought is, right? So if the thought is, and mindful self-compassion is another example we do a lot. In mindful self-compassion you do work where you are talking to yourself in a particular way. If it's working in a way that's functional, then it's helpful. But think about all the things that clients say that aren't, I'm just going to talk positively, right? And often that really doesn't work because it's cheap. There's a way in which it's cheap. And also in ACT we talk about how, well, if I say something like, well, I'm great, I'm a success. Well, it's only one word away from I'm not a success, right? That's the way that relationships, verbal relations work. The opposite is directly accessible there. So I think dialectics is helpful for that reason, because it helps us, well, maybe we can hold both of those. We don't have to pick one. Yeah. Yeah.
Shane, so how do you distinguish committed action versus the kind of avoidance that's kind of like exactly the example of digging, trying to dig out the figures out of the hole, but it's not the best way to do it. Yeah.
I think you get clients who talk about the ways that they're, and it's if you start using this language, they'll start talking about the ways in which they're taking committed actions. It's a process of figuring out what is somebody's values, what are the actual values? These are the values that they're stating. Is it pliance? Is it them wanting to, they're adopting cultural norms? It's what they think you want as the therapist for them to value. And you come back just again and again to, is that really important to you? If a client says it's really important to me that I'm mindful during my meetings at work, I'm probably going to call bullshit on that and be like, really, is that really important to you? And maybe there's a reason. Maybe it's that I'm going to get fired if I don't, and my job is important to me so that I can pay for my rent, and my rent is important to me because I enjoy not being out in the cold. Like, I believe that, but is there really an intrinsic value about if you don't love your job about being mindful at work? I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, thank you.